Hello everyone, I'm Inverse, and today we're going to be looking at the US versus Africa Core meta as it exists right now in Company of Heroes 3, patch version 1.0.7. Now, I wanted to focus on this matchup in particular because I think it is one of the most sort of figured out and settled metagames, at least among top players, in terms of what is sort of generally accepted as the optimal ways to play for both factions. And I also think it's a matchup that could use the most tweaking and adjustments because I think there's a lot of issues with the philosophies that are required to be played on both sides of this matchup. And I'm going to discuss a little bit about that as well as go through what the metagame looks like from both sides so that you as a player can be more informed of what the top players are doing and what you might want to try out if you're having trouble with this matchup in your own games. Now, this game here is a game between Dumai over here on Africa Core and Kimbo, who is a very good American player. Both of these players stream a lot on Twitch TV. I'll be posting links to their streams as well as my own in the description in case you want to watch myself or any of these players playing games live. Now, let's get started. And I'm not going to focus too much on the American side here because if you remember the American Airborne video that I posted a little bit ago, just after the release of Company of Heroes 3, what Kimbo does in this game is very similar to that build. He's going to go 4 Pathfinder spam. He's going to get out a half-track, a quad half-track as soon as possible. And then he's going to transition to Bazooka Paratroopers for AT support and eventually Tech 2 Tank Depot. He's going to make a few changes. Notably, he's going to use some additional airborne abilities that I'm going to talk about a little bit later, as well as airdropping AT guns for AT support. And we'll cover all of that a little bit later. But for the time being, I want to focus on Dumai's build order and some of the decisions that Dumai makes in the early game. Now, the early game for a lot of Africa Core players these days has basically ignored Panzer Grenadiers from the headquarters building almost entirely. You'll see some players get maybe a Panzer Grenadier, generally no more than 2, but Bersaglieri's from the Italian Combined Arms battle group are kind of the go-to infantry in the early game. They're very strong. They get upgraded very decently with an additional squad here and light machine guns on all of the squads for free from a battle group ability. They have very good grenades and they scale decently well into the mid and late game while also being only 30 manpower more than regular Panzer Grenadiers. So this is something you see in a lot of Africa Core high-level games these days. A lot of the time you'll also see multiple Panzer Pioneers come out, and you'll almost always see a bike come out. Now, the bike is extremely powerful because it can do a lot of good harassment damage in the early game against American units. It's also very good against Brits. It can cap. It's very fast. It can reverse now, which is a big change from Company of Heroes 1. And it also has a very handy self-repair ability. This you get immediately, no veterancy required. It has a decently long cooldown, and you can't heal or self-repair while moving, but it's very helpful for keeping this unit as independent as possible. And sort of independent vehicle play is a big theme of Africa Core and a big theme of this strategy, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. Now you'll see in the build order here, we've got an additional Panzer Pioneer coming out, and this is pretty much going to be it in terms of infantry for this strategy. Now, Africa Core is a very manpower-starved faction. If you look in here, we don't have any of these unlocked yet, but all of Africa Core's upgrades are pure manpower upgrades. There's no fuel cost at all, and the faction really wants to build a lot of vehicles, which are necessarily manpower intensive. So generally speaking, as Africa Core, you kind of want the minimum amount of infantry that you can get away with in order to maintain map control and make sure that you can tech sufficiently to not lose to the quad, because the quad is sort of the American player's big strength and big point of power in the early game for this strategy. And you really want to be careful that you're not caught too far out unawares when the half track comes out. And there's a few ways that you can deal with it. Ideally, we're going to see what Dumai is doing here, which is he's getting his tier 1 building. He's going to be teching directly to 8 rads, and he's going to use the 8 rads for 2 purposes. First is going to be dealing with and zoning the quad half track, and the second is going to be actually dealing with infantry like paratroopers and stuff like that. 8 rads have a lot of health. They're very tanky. They do a lot of infantry damage as well, and they're almost always a good idea to rush to against an American player. Against Brits, it's a little bit different because they have such early access to infantry AT on all of their infantry. But against Americans, 8 rads are basically the way to go. And you'll notice we've got the half track out now. It's going to be upgrading with the quad as it's moving out onto the field. And Dumai already has his tier 2 building up and getting the building that he needs in order to get the 8 rad. So Dumai is in a decent spot right now. This is coming up on sort of the early game strength for Kimbo, and we'll see sort of how he is able to take advantage of that and push Dumai off the map fairly significantly, to the point where there's going to have to be a fairly significant counterattack in order for Dumai to actually sort of regain the map. So you'll see what Dumai is doing right now is trying to force the half track to run around the map and waste time, because he knows he's very close to having his additional tech out. He needs a little bit more fuel. He needs about 30 seconds worth of fuel plus the build time of 38 seconds. So he's about a minute away from his counter to this half track. And you'll notice half track at this point doesn't actually have any kills. It's been run around. It's been sort of had its time wasted as much as possible, and Dumai's actually been able to maintain a decent amount of the map. So this is a very good response to Dumai for this sort of point of power that his opponent has. He's probably going to have to retreat now. He's sort of expended all of his delay capital that he could have used at this point, and he's got his 8 rad coming out. So this is a very standard on meta early game DAK build against Americans, against a fairly standard early game American build. One thing we haven't seen much in this game so far that is very powerful is the Pathfinder smoke abilities, but that's sort of a focus for another video. Smokes are very strong. And if you are an American player playing Pathfinders, you should definitely be using smokes to delay your opponent as much as possible. Very unfortunate mine placement here from Dumai. This half track isn't quite going to get there, but we have the 8 rad out. And so now, if we look at what Kimbo has on the field, his one counter to the 8 rad is this paratrooper squad. So as you'll notice, he, being very aware of sort of his strengths and weaknesses at this point in the game, decides, you know, I need a paratrooper as soon as possible. Very smart decision. Very unfortunate here that this half track is actually going to survive. This is a bit of a misstep on Dumai's part, but you can see the sort of very apparent strength of the 8 rad in this matchup. None of the infantry can really do much about it. Paratroopers can't even really one-on-one 8 rads. It's very difficult. You'll see not that much damage being done for bazookas, and it's just very difficult at this point for the American player to do much. So you'll notice we have another drop. I think this is an AT gun, although it might be another paratrooper squad. No, it's another paratrooper squad. So we've got 2 paratroopers, and that's sort of the sweet spot for being able to actually zone out an 8 rad. 1 paratrooper just isn't really enough. So you'll notice Dumai taking advantage of his counter timing. He is capping up a lot of the map, he's pushing around a lot, and he's actually gone for Assault Grens as his call-in rather than Panzerjägers. And this is something that, as a DAK player against Americans, you really want to strive for if you can. If you can delay with your early infantry until you get a 8 rad out to counter the half track, it's almost always better to go for Assault Grenadiers rather than Panzerjäger squads, at least in the super early game, because there's not really much mid-game vehicle that DAK is super afraid of once they have an 8 rad out. Even if you're looking at an M8 an M8 isn't that powerful against an 8-rad. They can kind of fight one-on-one, and the half-track, or the M8 will probably come out ahead in a head-to-head. But as you'll notice very shortly, we're going to have a second 8-rad coming out from Dumai, and that's another thing that's become fairly common these days. The reason for that is just 8-rads scale decently well, especially on larger maps. They're very fast, they can run around, and this Africa Core strategy that focuses on this right-hand side of vehicle upgrades with the M13 and Pact of Steel really benefits from the synergy of lots of light vehicles and just lots of vehicles in general benefiting from upgrades. So we'll notice a little bit later in the game that Dumai is going to focus on a lot of these upgrades here, vehicle survival, tungsten armor, and a couple more upgrades down here. And they are going to improve not just his M13s, but also his 8-rads. So at this point, there's not really a huge like tech jump from the American player, and this is where the game is really the hardest for Americans. And this is where we're going to talk very soon about a very key American ability, an ability that Kimbo got very recently but doesn't have the munitions to use, and that is Paradrop Reinforcements. Paradrop Reinforcements is an insane ability. For any of you who aren't aware of this ability, it designates a point on the map, and the point on the map is basically the size of the screen that you're looking at right now. So if I put this ability right in the middle of my screen right here, pretty much any infantry squad in this screen and even a little bit off this screen that takes unit losses will automatically reinforce from the sky. It's a very long duration ability. I believe it lasts for 45 seconds to a minute, and the reinforcements are free. So the big reason that this ability is so incredibly strong is the fact that the reinforcements don't cost manpower. So it's very difficult to wipe squads when the ability is live. It's also very difficult and very key that it's very difficult to wipe AT guns, because a big reason why AT guns are, in my opinion, extremely weak in Company of Heroes 3 is the combination of the fact that their pathing is a little wonky, they miss a lot, and they're very easy to decrew. And the airborne reinforcements alleviate that to some extent by making decrewing much less of a challenge. So something that we're going to have to pay attention to in the near future in this video, and we'll see sort of why it's both a necessary ability for Americans in this matchup in order to be competitive, and also an ability that, in my opinion, doesn't really have a place in the game. So at this point, you can sort of see the strategy taking shape on the Africa Core side, and from this point forward, the strategy for Dumai is get as many light vehicles and tanks as possible, and get as many upgrades for those vehicles and tanks as he possibly can. So you'll see at this point we have one of the Caros, one of the M13s, we have two of the 8-rads, and we have a half-track. We also have the vehicle survival package upgrade immediately. This is the first upgrade that I see Dumai get a lot, and it basically gives all of your vehicles smokes and also gives all of your vehicles additional health. So it's very powerful when you have so many vehicles and when you plan on building more vehicles. It's just something that gives you a lot of flexibility. Just like this right here gives you a lot of flexibility just in terms of running into a base, killing as many things as humanly possible. Just the amount of damage that these vehicles do to buildings as well as infantry and other vehicles is kind of absurd. And like that tank depot died in no time at all. There's really not much you can do to defend against this aside from mining up right here. And this is sort of the point where without that ability that I mentioned, things get a little bleak for Americans. Like, let's switch over to Kimbo. Hey guys, Future Inverse here. I realized as I was editing this video that I kind of glossed over this moment in the game, and it's actually, in my opinion, the turning point moment in this match. It's extremely important, and it's a really great showcase of a lot of the issues with the Paradrop Reinforcements ability, both why it's so powerful and why it's a little questionable that it's even in the game. So I wanted to circle back here and really focus on this one moment so that we could sort of dig deeper and understand exactly why it was as pivotal as I think it is. So first of all, I want us to focus on the allocation of units on the map. We see Africa Corps has all of their units on this middle right side, and they're coming up against 2 paratrooper squads with bazookas. Meanwhile, the American player has paradropped an AT gun up here on the north side. At the moment, this looks fairly safe. This is territory that he controls. There's a Pathfinder here. There's an engineer squad here. There is a quad half track here. There's also an additional few Pathfinders up here. So this is sort of the most controlled area of the map. This is actually going to turn out to be a little problematic, which we'll look at in a little bit. But I also wanted to point out this unit is being paradropped. It's not on the field right now. You can't see it. And there's only 2 seconds left of the paradrop reinforcements ability. So just keep that in mind for the near future. We're going to circle back to this. So if we get going now, we see the units down here come up against the paratroopers. Meanwhile, the 8-rads actually shift up to the top here. So right now, this is a terrible position for Kimbo to be in. So look at where the units are right now. We have a Bersaglieri squad that has seen the airdropped AT gun and is moving to attempt to decrew it as fast as possible. If we look at Kimbo's unit allocation here, aside from the 2 paratroopers, this AT gun is his only method of anti-tank against 2 8-rads and 2 M13 tanks. So a very dire situation. In any other match, without the paradrop reinforceability, look at what's around here. There's 2 8-rads, there's the Berg, and there's really not much that can contest this on Kimbo's side. There's a quad, but a quad can't really stand up to 1 8-rad, let alone 2. And then there's, you know, engineers and a Pathfinder that this Pathfinder is going to very quickly be forced to retreat. So this AT gun in any other circumstance should be in extreme trouble. It should almost certainly be decrewed, and then the 8-rad would be able to just attack move it down, and completely eliminate it, and all of a sudden Kimbo would be left without any AT, really, aside from his paratroopers, which aren't super effective against 2 8-rads, let alone 2 8-rads and 2 M13s. So we see the Bergs coming in, the 8-rads cleaning up the Pathfinder, and right here, you see this? You see this paradropped additional unit? This AT gun is still being reinforced from the paradrop reinforcements. This AT gun wasn't even on the ground and on the field when that reinforceability purported to end. It's still getting reinforced. We're gonna keep going. 2 more deaths. A grenade goes down. Grenade doesn't actually do that much damage. Another paradrop reinforcement. 2 more reinforcements. A third one. Now it's back up to full health. Full health again. Immediately getting recrewed constantly. And look at this right now. Look at how long we've been sitting here watching this, right? This has been at least, 5-10 seconds. This has got 2 8-rads shooting at it. It's got a Berg squad that threw a grenade and is also shooting at it. This should be a decrewed AT gun. Ignoring the fact that, this ability hasn't even been active for, what has it been, 30 seconds? The fact that this ability just at its core allows a unit like an AT gun to withstand this amount of fire without being decrewed is wild. It's very crazy, and it's a huge turning point for this game because this should be a dead AT gun. These paratrooper squads had to come from all the way down here, path all the way up through here in order to come and support. This should be dead by now, long before these paratrooper squads should be able to come in and support. Instead, what we're going to see is the paratrooper squads get here in time. The AT gun is still alive. It's still able to contribute. It's actually going to be able to turn around now and threaten these 8-rads. And the Parrots are also still being reinforced and able to ultimately push off the Berg and push off the ARADs. So at this point in the game, we went from the American player almost certainly losing their one primary form of AT and having the Africa Corps player be able to push off of that with their two M13s and their two 8-rads to basically wipe the entire map, to, oh, all of a sudden the AT gun survives. Paratroopers were both allowed to come and support and also reinforce themselves, even though the ability is long gone. And all of a sudden, Kimbo's in a decent place because his opponent has low health vehicles that are going to have to run away, spend some time repairing. In the meanwhile, all these units are able to cap around the map instead of getting pushed off because the AT gun was killed quickly and the 8-rads could reposition and do lots of damage. Anyways, this is what I wanted to focus on. I wanted to really point out how pivotal this moment is, and hopefully you understand now a little bit more why I think this reinforceability is a little ridiculous. Anyways, back to the show. We go back to Dumai. He didn't lose anything there, right? So Dumai didn't lose anything in this engagement. He lost a bunch of health on his vehicles, but he didn't lose any like hard resources. But look at how much worse off he is after that engagement compared to before. He's lost map control. Kimbo is moving up onto the north here, capping as much of the map as possible, exploiting smokes, utilizing smokes rather, to his advantage, and really able to keep the map in a way that he really wouldn't have been able to do if he had been forced to retreat those squads. Like, imagine if he has his AT gun is decrewed. These paratroopers that were supporting his AT gun, rather than staying on the map and forcing the light vehicles to retreat, imagine if they had to retreat as well, because there was a lot of vehicles, there was a lot of infantry. He was outnumbered, he was outpositioned. He wouldn't have been able to stay on the map. He wouldn't have an AT gun right now. He would only have one AT gun because this AT gun would have been decrewed. It would have been killed by the light vehicles very quickly. And so just by virtue of a single ability, a single extremely strong ability, Kimbo has been able to not only stay in this game in a scenario that probably should have cost him the game, or at least put him in a very, very bad position where he had, lost units, given up map control. All of a sudden, he didn't lose units, he didn't give up map control, and he gained back map control of his own. And we're looking at a situation where minutes before in that engagement, Dumai, dominance, extremely far ahead, extremely advantageous position, and all of a sudden, one single seemingly inconsequential ability, just reinforcing some squads on the field, he just couldn't fight into it. And the biggest issue with that ability, in my opinion, is just the fact that there's really no downside to an American player popping it, given the resource allocation of Company of Heroes 3 maps. Like, Dumai has very little of the map. He still has 26 munitions income. Kimbo has 41 munitions income. That means in 2 minutes time, he will recoup the munitions that it costs to use this ability. At that rate, it's really a no-brainer. Why would you not use that ability at any moment? The flip side is, imagine this matchup without that ability. Imagine how difficult it would be as Americans to deal with the absolutely ridiculous light vehicle spam that Africa Corps is able to muster. Just to give you like an idea of how cheap these things are, this Caro with Pact of Steel, you can't, oh yeah, we can actually see it right here. This is 272 manpower and 38 fuel. You could get 2 of these for the price of a Sherman, and 2 of these vehicles basically kill a Sherman. You can have 3 of these, and they will kill 2 Shermans generally. We also can finally look at all of the upgrades, and this is what I want to focus on right now, because this is what turns this strategy from pretty good and fairly powerful to very, very difficult to beat and just insanely strong. So there's these 4 vehicles, this quadrant down at the bottom, these 4 upgrades that I really want to focus on. The first one that we talked about earlier was vehicle survival. Vehicle survival gives you smokes, it gives you additional health on all of your vehicles, 200 manpower. Tungsten core ammunition, 200 manpower, gives all of your vehicles increased damage and penetration. Just a straight buff to every single one of these vehicles on the field, right? Next upgrade is emergency repair kits. This is very powerful because I believe he has it. Yep, you can see the healing symbol on top of all these vehicles. Basically what that upgrade does is for, I believe it's 250 manpower, all of your light vehicles get self-healing when they're out of combat. And not even stationary out of combat period. So you could be running around to cap another side of the map. You could be just supporting, running back, and your vehicles are constantly gaining more health. Now, it's fairly slow. You do benefit from infantry repairing of these vehicles still, but the fact that those upgrades give you such field presence and the ability to just run around and gain at least a little bit of additional manpower, or rather additional like health on these already extremely powerful units is just so ridiculously strong. And the final one I wanted to talk about is Rapid Advance. Rapid Advance is usually the last upgrade that you're going to want to get. It's a bit of a nice to have, but essentially what it does is gives all of your vehicles, and not even just light vehicles, even something like the Stug 3, it gives all of your vehicles the ability to cap the map and increases their speed. And when you have an M13 blob with all of these upgrades, it's actually kind of ridiculous how powerful it is. So at this point, Dumai is kind of in the late game of this strategy. And the late game of this strategy is focusing on upgrades for your light vehicles, keeping your light vehicles alive as much as possible. You really want to have at least 2 M13s on the field at all times. Ideally, you would have 3, because 3 is a very powerful number against American vehicles. Like, 3 Caros can pretty much kill any American tank very quickly, and I think we'll see that right now. We've got a bit of a push here. Caro's coming in. You see he's focusing on the Hellcat as much as possible, because this is the high value unit and the unit that he really wants to kill. And look at this, like, front armor penetration against the tank destroyer, just very, very easy to just kill everything. And you'll notice again, the airborne reinforcements, plane isn't even around anymore, still reinforcing these squads. And this is the main reason why this fight wasn't a complete wash, because this AT gun would have been lost, both of these would have been destroyed, this paratrooper squad probably would have had to retreat a little bit earlier. And this is kind of the meta, you know, this is the game. This is US versus Africa Corps when 2 players know what they're doing. It's an Africa Corps player spamming as much light vehicle with upgrades as humanly possible, and an American player trying to hold on for dear life using airdropped reinforcements to keep his units on the field as much as humanly possible. And the issue I have with this matchup, sort of the challenge that I see for Relic balance-wise in the future, is you can't just nerf one side, nerf the other side, nerf these powerful abilities, these powerful units, and hope that everything will resolve itself. Because as I mentioned, I do honestly believe that it's extremely difficult for Americans past the early game to really do much against Africa Corps without some of these abilities. Like, Americans really do need that airborne reinforce ability in order to remain competitive against the absolutely insane amount of light vehicle strength that Africa Corps is able to muster. I mean, just look at these costs. 272 manpower. The fuel is basically nothing on Company of Heroes 3 maps that have a lot of fuel. And the fact that, like, Dumai hasn't increased his infantry strength this entire game, and he barely has any infantry strength. He lost a Panzer Pio. He has a couple Bersaglieri squads. He has an assault half-track. But he really doesn't have much in the way of infantry strength, but he doesn't really need it, because he's able to cap what part of the map he needs to cap, and very near in the future, he's going to have ridiculously strong vehicles that can do the capping themselves. And at that point, you're kind of laughing as an Africa Corps player against Americans, because you have all these extremely strong light vehicles that do need a little bit of support from other light vehicles and to some extent infantry in order to be super effective and to not, you know, get swarmed by paratroopers like this. But you can do so much with them. They have smokes, they have additional damage, they have additional health, they can tank so much. They can cap points, they can move incredibly quickly, they can out move like American tanks 100%. They're just extremely powerful, and it's extremely difficult. Like, look at that. Those are 2 volleys from bazookas, and this 8-rad lost a quarter of its health. Like, that's kind of what I'm talking about when I say that once this strategy gets rolling and once you get to the late game, I really don't know what the solution is aside from what we're seeing Kimbo attempt in this game, which is, hey, I'm going to build as many vehicles as I can. I'm going to take advantage of paradropping reinforcements to keep my AT guns and my paratroopers on the field. And I'm going to, you know, push out and see what I can do. See if I can get as much done as I can. But there's just, like, it's just so difficult against all of these vehicles. Like, we've got a Martyr coming out. There's just so many options that a Africa Corps player can go down at this point in the game, and that's why this strategy and sort of this build is very meta right now, and everyone is doing it, and it's extremely powerful because you just have so much flexibility, and it is, I will say, it's very micro intensive. You have a lot of vehicles, and vehicles are sort of a double-edged sword in Company of Heroes, because you can obviously repair vehicles, which means damage to vehicles is in some sense quote-unquote free to repair. Obviously, and a lot of the times you're repairing it with time. You know, like you're spending a unit's time, you're spending just a vehicle's time in the case of auto repairing like this, but you are spending time in order to get that repair. And so that's, you know, time in any RTS game is a resource in and of itself, so it's not an absolute zero cost. But in terms of just the amount of manpower that you need in order to continue to build and replace these units when they're lost, like just think of the sort of the difference a mistake can mean for both of these factions, right? So if Americans make a mistake with the Sherman, they're losing 360 manpower and 90 fuel. The manpower isn't really the end of the world. It's pretty significant later in games, but 90 fuel, even in Company of Heroes 3, where fuel is relatively easy to come by in the late game, 90 fuel is pretty significant, you know? It's not nothing. It's pretty serious. So you're losing 90 fuel, whereas a Africa Corps player could lose 2 of their M13s and kill your Sherman and still come out ahead, in my opinion. Because they're losing a little bit more manpower, they're losing far less fuel, and it's so much easier to replace the M13s. First of all, you need essentially half as much manpower to build another M13 as opposed to even just being able to start building a Sherman. And you don't even need to wait for the time cost of that unit finishing construction because it's a call-in. So you're saving however much time it takes for a unit to be built, a Sherman to be built, you know, whatever the 30, 45 seconds it takes for a Sherman to be constructed. You don't have to deal with that, and you have far lower costs in terms of fuel. So it's very difficult for an American player to come back from mistakes in this matchup, in my opinion, whereas a Africa Corps player, they're punished relatively less for any given mistake, any given misstep, and it's just very difficult. I mean, if we switch over to Kimbo's view right now, he hasn't really gained much in terms of strength since we looked at this 15 minutes ago, right? He's still got a few Pathfinders, he still has his 2 paratroopers, he's got 2 Shermans now, which is good, and he has a couple AT guns. So he's able to push forward a little bit and do a little bit of damage, and he might be able to, you know, kill an 8-rad and stuff like that. But he's not really able to do a whole lot more than that, because he's got AT guns that are difficult to use back here and susceptible to being decrewed, even if paradropping stuff, you know, makes it a little bit easier. And it's just very difficult for him to recover if he actually does make mistakes and, for example, loses these Shermans. Like, at this point, these Shermans are his game. If he loses these Shermans, it's pretty much, you know, pretty much the end of the game. Well, that's all I've got for you today. A bit longer video, but I hope you found it useful. As I mentioned before, I'll be posting links to my stream as well as the streams of the players in this game in the description, along with a link to the replay if you want to watch the rest of the game yourself. It's a good finish, I definitely recommend it. But until next time, have fun in your games.